just by shifting paper around, these slobs can make $60–65 million in a single transaction. That would take care of all of the layoffs in the city. So it's reckless, it's cruel, and it's a disgrace.
There'd be a fair number of bankers, of course, who'd say, well, it's the unions who have been too greedy. Now, what would your reaction be to that?
I guess they're right in a way. If you can make $60 million on a single transaction and a worker makes $8–9,000 a year, I suppose they're correct, and as they go back to their little estates in Greenwich, Connecticut, I want to wish them well, the slobs.
When I was 19, I joined the Army. That was a confusing time for me. I didn't seem to be doing anything in my life, and this worried my mother, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't worry me as well. Within 1 year, I dropped out of high school, got my GED, and started working for General Motors. I didn't know who I was. I worked on an assembly line that had shiny new cars passing me, and my job was to look at the roofs of these cars to determine if they had sunroofs and spoilers. If the model number on the screen did not match the model number of the car, I hit a button. And if it did, I hit another button, and the car continued its journey. I was paid $18 an hour for this job, and I hated it. But I got paid well, and the isolation and simplicity of the job meant I got to read books that were on my reading list. I even started reading a lot of religious material. I was an atheist, but I at least wanted to understand it. I read a book about Buddhism, and the message I took away from it was that in order to truly know yourself, you must destroy what you know. A sort of rebirth. One day I was standing in the factory, which was this huge empty-looking place, and the nearest people to me were two guys who wiped down the cars as they traveled down the line. I had this sudden anxiety and an intense feeling of loneliness. I felt like I couldn't do the job anymore. It felt pointless. I saw myself in those old men's faces, withered, old, going on along in life without purpose.
Instead, Patti Smith and many others became a new kind of individual radical who watched the decaying city with a cool detachment. They didn't try and change it. They just experienced it.
I walked out on the job without giving notice. That very same day I joined the Army, requested Fort Benning as my training camp, which was an all-male, typically infantry camp, and I struck out to find out who I was. The first day was stressful. It was the first time I was given any real responsibility. They told me that I was responsible for getting my team to the airport, getting on the plane, and being delivered safely to the fort in Georgia. We managed to get there in one piece, and when we did finally get there, all that long hair I had been growing for years was promptly shaven. And for the first time since I was young, I saw the shape of my skull. I looked different already. I wasn't used to waking up early. I was one of those kids that went to bed at 2 a.m. and woke up at 2 p.m. Some would call us lazy. I called it sleeping well. But on that first night at the end processing center, I was woken at 6 a.m. to the sound of a clattering metal pot and the sound of...
Reveille! Drop your cocks and grab your socks!
It was difficult at first, but the more they forced us awake, the easier it was to jump out and make our beds. A regimented life became the norm, standing silently to get breakfast, standing silently to get immunizations, standing silently to get glasses, to get boots and BDUs, standing silently as a drill sergeant berates me for not wearing my fucking cover while outside. Things that were abnormal became normal. We were not individuals, not anymore. I was told that we were a team, that the person sitting next to me was a member of my new family. They paired us off, called us battle buddies. My battle buddy was my new brother. I was not to leave him behind, and if something happened to him, and I let it happen, something bad was going to happen to me. I did things in the Army that I never thought I could do. I held a live grenade in my hand, cooked it, and threw it with the intent of having it explode the minute it hit the ground for maximum effectiveness. Me, the kid that wouldn't harm a fly, who studied Buddhism, was about to learn how to become an effective killing machine.
If you survive recruit training, you will be a weapon. You will be a minister of death, praying for war. But until that day, you are pukes. You are the lowest form of life on earth. You are not even human fucking beings. You are nothing but unorganized, grabastic pieces of amphibian shit. Because I am hard, you will not like me. But the more you hate me, the more you will learn. I am hard, but I am fair. There is no racial bigotry here. I do not look down on niggers, types, wops, or greasers. Here you are all equally worthless.
The drill sergeants enacted what they called total control. We went to bed when we were told to, relaxed when told to, marched, ate, and relieved ourselves of waste when told to. We did constantly what we were told to. At the end of the day, we engaged in what the drill sergeants called smoking, which essentially meant that they worked us out until our muscles smoked from the effort. Before bed, we stood in a line, completely naked, holding a bar of soap, a towel, and our dicks, and waited to get an ice cold shower before we were allowed to go to sleep. That first night, I heard someone muffled, their head in their pillow, crying themselves asleep. After a week, it was normal. When we stood in line, we didn't bother covering ourselves up, and a cold shower was what we looked forward to the entire day. When given the choice between labor on the weekends or church, we all invariably chose church.
Private Joker, do you believe in the Virgin Mary? Sir, no, sir!
Even non-believers like me. And in time, through the stresses of the week, I found myself believing and reading the Bible, not out of a need to understand its failings, but out of a need to understand and gather faith. We were told the laws of the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and told ridiculous things like sex that was not missionary position would be considered sodomy and punishable under the law. We were told disobeying any order was punishable by death in wartime. And eventually we came to accept these laws, even though the rational side of our brains knew the UCMJ was nonsense, and that just because you had a silver bar on your collar didn't make your decisions good or make you smart. We had to suppress that side of us. After I left the military, I was Christian. Born again, I guess. I believed in a higher power, even though my whole life I made fun of religion. My personal philosophy was that there was no
invisible man.
But back then I found myself believing. I found myself excusing inconsistencies in thought, excusing logical leaps. When reading the Bible and coming across something that made no sense, I would actually say, I give it up to God. This was not me. This is not who I was. I had remade myself to be sure. I destroyed everything I knew so that I could find myself, and through subtle, small changes over a period of time, the military had made me into what it wanted me to be. I found that if the changes in my life happened over a period of time, and were small enough, or large and violent enough, I would be willing to accept even the most ridiculous of lies. It took my father to break that trance. When I denied climate change, we had a heart-to-heart talk over Chinese food. He told me about the data and I denied its validity. When I saw the disappointed look on his face, we stopped talking about it and something inside my brain just snapped. I went home that night and looked at the science of the greenhouse effect online. I read about how tiny particulates in the air from pollution caused the light and thus the energy from the sun, which had bounced off the ground, to bounce back off the clouds of pollution and back towards the earth, making it warmer. And I did photography, and I knew how diffuse light worked. How using smoke from dry ice can cause the light to bounce around and become softer. I couldn't deny what I knew was a demonstrable fact. I couldn't believe who I had become. Who the hell was I?
Scientists knew about the faulty design for the O-ring for years, yet a series of management decisions resulted in 6 different waivers being granted for O-ring launch constraints, the most critical of which was the safe temperature for the launch. 10 years after the incident, Diane Vaughn, sociologist, published her findings and investigation into the effort. Vaughn's book, The Challenger Launch Decision, more accurately described what was the root cause of the incident. Vaughn discussed the normalization of deviance.
We see this method throughout our history. Tiny changes justified which take away from us to give to those who are supposed to serve. When my trance had been broken and I started to look at the world through a critical eye, I started to see where the lies were being told and sold. It was crazy to me that we had become to be so accepting in life that the rich were allowed to get richer while the poor became poorer. Christians who believed in charity would vote for those who would get rid of welfare programs, that we would live in places where smog hangs over our heads and chokes us in our sleep, and deny that pollution is a problem we should curb. The effects seemed to be that while we would fight for a while for what we believed to be right, in time we would give up as apathy would set in. or another tragedy would happen just in time to take our attention away from what was important to us just days ago. The will to fight wanes due to the fact that even terrifying truths can be seen as normal through time and exposure. I saw all of this through new eyes.
Many of those who had taken LSD in the 60s were convinced that it was more than just another drug, that it opened human perception and allowed people to see new realities that were normally hidden from them.
See, the ones that have white in them are really great.
This chilling effect that inspired political and general apathy is known as hypernormalisation, and it is the key to understanding microtransactions and how Facebook was able to influence the current state of video games and the industry as a whole. So let's dig in, shall we? When Facebook was new, it was an exclusive place. You needed to be in the club to get in, or someone had to know you. It was the internet's equivalent of a speakeasy. You couldn't get a Facebook account unless you were enrolled in a college or had a college email address. The exclusivity gave it brand recognition, and people were clamoring to get an account because it seems that people want what they cannot have. The first of many changes the site underwent was in opening up to the public. For a while there was a debate. See, the public knew that Facebook's current model was unsustainable. Their database of users was rivaling that of MySpace and was growing quickly. Eventually, Facebook needed to make a decision, create a subscription service and force people to pay to play on their platform, which could have been disastrous, or adopt an advertiser-friendly model. Around the same time, Google was experimenting with a new type of ad, a smart ad. It was called Analytics, and in 2005 it tracked the usage of users through tracking what websites those users frequented. It was sold to us as a way to serve us targeted ads for products we actually wanted. And suddenly, people started noticing that when they went to Amazon and looked up a new camera that they wanted to buy, they would suddenly see ads on Google appearing showing them the very same camera they were just looking at elsewhere. At first, people were incensed by this seeming invasion of privacy, but over the months, these ads became increasingly more prevalent and it netted Google huge profits. In the first quarter of 2005, in fact, Google nearly doubled its profit as it began selling off this data to advertisers and users of Google AdSense and AdWords. Facebook's choice was obvious at this point. It saw that the future of business was data, the collection and selling of that data to interested parties. The choice to go to an advertiser-friendly platform commenced, and in 2005, Facebook and Zuckerberg created its first in-house ad sales team. We take for granted these ads now, as for the most of us who have ad blockers, we no longer see the insidiousness of their privacy invasion, but upon turning off these ad blockers, it is not odd to see ads showing for products on Facebook that you were just looking at on other platforms, which points to the idea that these companies are either sharing information about you, or at the very least, using the very same methods to track your usage on the internet. With vast stores of information available to the highest bidder, Facebook was quickly becoming one of the most powerful companies operating in cyberspace.
And here's Santa Claus urging you to give cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, to your friends for Christmas. And there's a doctor who, in the small print, it says he works hard and you can trust him. And more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. That's pretty close to a recommendation, isn't it?
This model worked out well, and in 2004, Facebook made a modest $380,000 in profit. But in 2005, when the ad boom hit its highest, Facebook made a leap to the Millionaire Club with a whopping $9 million in profits. The ad tracking model led to the creation of an echo chamber of our own creation. As tools to curate what we see became ever more complex, the data that Facebook had been collecting on us began to be used to curate the ads we would see based strictly on things we liked. This normalized our lives to the point where we no longer were confronted with things online that challenged our perceptions of reality, with the ability to unfollow users without unfriending them, allowing you to essentially silence friends that do not think like you, to the algorithm able to intelligently filter out news and products that offend or do not interest you. Facebook became like a safe space. Whether you be on the left or the right of the political spectrum, your profile became a bubble through which nothing negative or challenging could permeate. You can imagine the effect that this has on us. Seeing and reading material that challenges our preconceived notions makes us think in 3 dimensions about the issue that we previously believed we understood. Like my father and his disappointed look, seeing things you don't agree with puts the bug of doubt in your brain, which won't stop its buzzing until you reconcile that belief. YouTube soon followed suit. Soon video games can be made to take advantage of this new glut of data and marketed in much the same way as inoffensive wastes of time. This is where Zynga comes in. Zynga started making social media games for Facebook around 2007, and in 2009 it launched its biggest title, Farmville, complete with microtransactions. Some say that microtransactions have their roots in China and other Asian cultures where game piracy is rampant and game studios were forced to find other ways besides the cash up front model to make money. Microtransactions then were for things like game-breaking items, potions, EXP boosts, things like that, which leveled the playing field for people who couldn't spend 18 hours a day grinding out gear and levels in popular Korean MMOs. Puzzle Pirates is the first game that I remember to open up the floodgates for microtransactions in the USA with Doubloon Oceans. Zynga, I believe, had stumbled onto a gold mine as developing games for a platform like Facebook gave them access to a treasure trove of info about their prospective users, and using a time-gated model gave them the opportunity to trade game time for real-world currency, since it was shown at the time that people spent an inordinate amount of time on Facebook instead of working. Gating off time became an effective and profitable way to manage the free-to-play model, and now Facebook had an all-new revenue stream. A flood of games like Mafia Wars and Farmville saturated the market, and soon to follow were the collectible card games. How did they do it? It was through the power of social media. When a player runs out of stamina or whatever resources required to keep playing, the genius idea was to allow the player to market their game to other players by giving referral opportunities to players in exchange for stamina boosts and in-game cash. The way it worked was you could ask your friends to give you a boost, and if they signed up for an account, you got some free in-game stuff, which ramped to even better in-game items the more people you signed up. It was a sort of legal digital pyramid scheme. This technique worked so well that at one point Zynga was valued to be worth $1 billion as they were able to see the idea of buying virtual items and virtual cash in an online game to people who have never played a game before. This was the true start of the casual game market and would soon be the very thing that began the slow descent of hardcore gaming scene. With this new glut of brand new players, a potential new profit sector of new gamers was set up for grabs for the first AAA company to take advantage of it. The question was, which company would be the first to seize the opportunity? With a gaming market that is seemingly untapped, a new phrase was being coined: whales. Whales is a term used to describe a consumer of free-to-play games that will spend a ludicrous amount of money on a game that they really like in order to play more or get an advantage over other players who don't spend the money. These players are typically casual gamers who are new to games. They're usually tricked into spending money, believing it is the only way to proceed, or sometimes they are hardcore gamers who no longer have the time to spend playing, but have more expendable income than they know what to do with. Whole panel discussions are now devoted to this topic at E3 and GDC as microtransactions have become more and more prevalent. This model of profit only affected the free-to-play market, however, and the idea that this type of business model could ever bleed into the cash up front model seemed ludicrous to us. But like rat poison administered at a low enough dose, microtransactions eventually became something we see in nearly every AAA release. But when did it start? The first bit of poison administered was Day 1 DLC. See, DLC had been a thing for a while at this point. It was a quick and efficient way to give the player base more of a game they liked after its release, while netting the company a few dollars on the side to create their newest title. Then companies like EA and Capcom tried an experiment: Day 1 DLC. In 2009, EA released a game you may have heard of called Dragon Age Origins. This was a game I remember hearing about years prior that I was absolutely stoked to see. I remember hearing that this game would include a level editor that was much like the editor we saw in Neverwinter Nights, which was one of my favorite games to play online. Instead, what we got was a very good game with a little fine print secret. It was one of the many examples of a company charging you full price for a video game, then chopping it up and gating the content behind a paywall. With the character available only to pre-orders and a Day 1 DLC pack called Warden's Keep, this became a model of profit for games yet to be released. The reaction to this news was lukewarm in the gaming media, but the reaction in forums and the customer base was bitter. The anger was not yet there, as Warden's Keep was an underwhelming bit of content. Then Capcom released Street Fighter X Tekken, and it had the audacity to release the game with characters gated behind another paywall it called DLC. The worst part was that the characters they were selling were actually completed and on the disc. The most egregious of these practices, in my opinion, has to be when Destiny was chopped up and sold to us incomplete, with some of the raids to be released in Taken King already on the original vanilla Destiny disc, which you could glitch into if you knew how. All of this was an experiment to see how far they could push the consumers before we pushed back. And push back we did.
You're so greedy, Joe, you and all your viewers!
The anger with these practices reached a crescendo, and in 2012, EA was voted the worst company of the year, a title they would win more than once. Season passes were introduced by Rockstar Games with a modestly priced content pack to be released for LA Noire. This allowed the companies to make a bet on how much DLC they could create by measuring the amount of pre-orders and season passes that were sold up front, and was a much more elegant solution, even though it was still a terrible practice that probably ruined Battlefront. It was still met with a lukewarm reception, and at its outset, as the public apathy had begun to set in with fighting DLC and all the shady business practices behind them. The public's ability to fight the good fight had begun to wane. Publishers did not stop there, however. Soon we began to see microtransactions in our online first-person shooters. At first, it was for cosmetics. We were okay with this because we believed it did not affect gameplay, and if people wanted to spend their money on things that did not exist, we did not care. Only a few of the online communities continue to rage over this. One YouTube personality in particular fought this practice consistently, and this is Jim Sterling. While other gaming personalities greeted these changes with the shoulder shrug of "it doesn't affect me, so it's not a problem." Then Call of Duty released items and supply drops that were overpowered and changed the game, and most importantly, was content that was not only not available to find normally due to drop rates being so low that the chance of finding them without spending money was nigh impossible for normal players, but was not even available to buy outright, and was instead randomly given to those who spent real money for a chance to win the weapon that they wanted. This is hypernormalization at work. It introduces itself into a system slowly, changing small, bite-sized things just enough so that the public who are against it either suffer from the apathy that a long fight induces, or become accustomed and immune to it like periodic doses of cyanide. A 2016 study on adolescent gambling from the Gambling Commission in the UK revealed that in 2011, gambling among youths was at an all-time high with a rate of 23%. The study was conducted under a sample of schools with pupils filling out paper self-completed questionnaires while under interviewer supervision. The sample in 2016, for example, was 2,400 children aged 11 to 15. The study began in 2007 and reported a rate of 22% with a dip to 19% from 2008 and another large spike in 2011. These numbers, of course, do not consider loot boxes as a form of gambling, even though in cases like CSGO, it obviously fits the definition. For some correlation, Call of Duty introduced microtransactions in 2011 with the release of Advanced Warfare. This only shows correlation, however, and not necessarily causation, as every subsequent year saw a decline in the amount of adolescent gambling by as much as 2% a year to its current level in 2016 of 16%. More research needs to be done, but I would be willing to wager that the reason we saw such a precipitous decline was games like Call of Duty and CSGO pulling users away from that method of gambling, since buying keys online is much easier than, say, online poker when you're underage, and as of 2013, when CSGO started offering a loot crates and keys system, the gambling rate was at an all-time reported low of 15%. I am therefore proposing that if loot boxes were considered, in a research term, gambling, this number would be either around or higher than what was reported years ago. In 2005, a bill was passed that allowed online poker to be legal in the UK. Up until this point, it was illegal because of age verification issues and other safeguards that became weaker when the player was shielded behind the anonymity of the internet. In the US, the founders of PokerStars, Full Tilt Poker, and Absolute Poker were indicted on charges of violating the UIGEA Act. The companies allegedly tried to circumvent the UIGEA rules with the help of other companies that acted as payment processors by disguising the revenue as payments for non-existent items like jewelry and golf balls. This highlights the issue facing legislation of this type of gambling. In 2008, the numbers of adolescent gambling in the US between the ages of 14 to 15 were 68% of males who tried it at least once, and 53% of females. Frequent gambling between males was at a whopping 13%, and a minor 5% for females. In the UK, the problem gambling numbers were below 1%, but in the US, problem gambling for teens was at an average of almost 10% for males and a negligible 1% for females. Up until 2005, gambling was seen as a vice, and online gambling was seen for the dangers it posed to impressionable youth. Yet, as the normalization of deviant behavior does over time, there was no fight left in us, and in time we became to accept it as normal. The other part of hypernormalization is the bombardment of information that deliberately confuses the masses. When Capcom caught flack over their use of on-disc DLC, the usual deflection we would hear is that on-disc DLC was used because the assets on a disc were incomplete and were placed on a disc to ensure that once they were completed, most of the data would not need to be downloaded. Capcom was betting on winning the support of people from countries that have bandwidth caps, not realizing that those numbers are few, and the brunt of their consumer base do not suffer from such limitations. It was sold to us as a service, that this was for our own convenience, when in fact the assets were on the disc and playable, as day one videos showed people who had hacked the content on a disc and were able to play as the DLC characters. This clearly showed that Capcom was, in fact, culling content from its game to be held at ransom from its consumers. Most people do not know this side of the story, however, as the gaming media at large were complicit in a lie. They sold the story of on-disc DLC as a convenience, and as such, many people bought this line, and Capcom got away with it. We see this same thing in the media, and this is the power of hypernormalization as a technique. For example, during the Bush administration, reporters were often given talking points, questions which the administration would be answering and not answering. It was sold as a way to avoid the awkward silences that accompany a question unanswered in the interest of national security. But as Peter Jennings put it when asked in an interview for The New Yorker, I recently did a story on a senior figure in the Bush White House and was told in advance, "It better be good," Jennings recalls, which I thought was rather naked. It wasn't a threat, but it didn't sound like a joke. There is a feeling among some members of the press corps that you are either favored by the administration or not, and that will have something to do with your access. If journalists do not have access to the facts, they can only report what they can investigate. And if the gatekeepers of knowledge have ostensibly sealed the gate, well, we've witnessed what has happened over the last decade or more. If the White House holds all the facts and only allows certain outlets access to those facts, what you get is a journalism echo chamber where articles on several news outlets start to look eerily similar in not only tone, but down to the letter. This was spun by Andrew Card when asking about press standards that, "It's not our job to be sources," he replied, flushing. "The taxpayers don't pay us to leak. I feel strongly that people who get paid taxpayer dollars should be doing their job. If their job is like Ashley's," Ashley Snee is a member of the press staff who sat in on this interview, "if their job is to talk to the press, they should talk to the press. If their job is to help develop policy, it's to talk to the people who are involved in that policy-making process. They don't get paid to talk to the press. Our job is not to make your job easy." The same appears to be true of the gaming press, with companies like Konami, EA, and Activision actively blacklisting prominent YouTube reviewers from getting advanced review copies of their games in favor of reviewers that stay on message. Bethesda went even so far as to deny all review outlets access to early copies of their games. When Metal Gear Solid 5 was set to release, the game was surrounded by controversy. Konami had fired its creator, rushed the game out unfinished with an entire final act unresolved, and to make things worse, a YouTuber who was, as of that time, not very well known, released an expose that exposed Konami and all of its underhanded dealings. Konami issued a copyright strike against his channel, and the Streisand effect took hold. There wasn't anyone in gaming who didn't know what they had done. Even with all this controversy, the game sold gangbusters because Konami did something quite brilliant. They held a review camp. The review camp was their way of avoiding giving the gaming press a review copy. It was set up as a 2-day event, and the reviewers of all the major non-blacklisted outlets were invited, and subsequently rushed through the content. As a result, nearly every review score for this game was praising it, because without the ability to work on a review and take the package as a whole and see it critically, the writers were forced through the content and heavily scrutinized by Konami staff. There is a certain feeling of biting the hand that feeds you whenever a game is reviewed. And I can only imagine what the feeling must have been like when writing a review for a game in the very place the game was made. The true strength of hypernormalization is to flood the reader, the viewer, the consumer with as much conflicting information as possible as to create a cloud of confusion around what is fact and fiction. To unravel this knotted thread, the consumer must research and be skeptical. But when the consumer reaches a saturation point, a point when the amount of information is so vast that they can no longer see the point in questioning it all, the usual reaction to this glut of info is a resounding sigh and a shoulder shrug. The effect has been endearingly titled by Adam Curtis of the BBC as "Oh dearism."
His aim is to undermine people's perception of the world, so they never know what is really happening. Zherkov turned Russian politics into a bewildering, constantly changing piece of theatre. He sponsored all kinds of groups, from neo-Nazi skinheads to liberal human rights groups. He even backed parties that were opposed to President Putin. But the key thing was that Zherkov then let it be known that this was what he was doing.
One need only look at the healthcare bill that started at a bloated 906 pages. There isn't a human alive aside from one with an eidetic memory who can comprehend a bill of that size. So what are the chances that your average American could? If a man can be convinced through the same technique to blow himself up in the name of a cause, then isn't anything possible? Our minds are frail and malleable. I see a future in which games are sold to you in piecemeal. A game of the future where the game is free but a sword swing costs you a penny. Where death is permanent but a resurrect is just $1. A future where you can punch your way to the end of the game, but the ammo for your gun costs just $1 a clip. Keep in mind that it was not too long ago that people were worried about the threat of surveillance with the inventions of Easy Pass, red light cameras, and the iPhone GPS. And within a decade, there are people calling for the arrest of whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning for crimes against the state for unveiling the scope of the government's illegal surveillance activities. It wasn't too long ago that these people would have been called heroes, but through the years of constant threat of terrorism and the fear-mongering from both the sensationalized press and our own government, we have become isolated and afraid of one another. But the real dangers of normalizing the fleecing of customers is that it is a dead end. When the very games made for our entertainment begin to cannibalize themselves in the name of profit, it is the first signal that something is wrong with the system creating it. That the budgets are too high, the technology frivolous, the efforts to maintain progress too costly to shoulder for much longer. Outlandish greed is normally the precursor to collapse. I want to thank the following people for their support on Patreon. And if you like this video and you want to see more like it, give me a like, subscribe, and comment below. And if you would like to support this channel, consider donating on Patreon. This is Strategy, signing out.